And it is my privilege to introduce our moderator for this evening's conversation, Eva Martin Blythe.
Thank you, Courtney. Very few things leave me speechless, but this performance really almost brings tears to my eyes, and if I let it, it would bring tears to my eyes. Thank you, Dr. Young.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing Fannie Lou Hamer with us. Some of us might remember her at the convention, the 64 convention, but not necessarily in her environment at home or in her interactions with others, with other politicians, with politicians of significance who she looked to influence. I certainly was struck by the similarities between things that she was saying 50 odd years ago and the things that the Black Lives Matter movement is saying today. As things change, they remain the same. That's a sad commentary. That doesn't mean that we should stop or by any stretch of the imagination be deterred from the work that's ahead of us. I want to say thank you to our panelists, and in just a moment I'll ask them to each introduce themselves. But I want to take just a moment and tell you why this performance and why this activity is important to the YWCA. Nationally, our mission is the elimination of racism and the empowerment of women. Some number of months ago, we began to talk about, and Councilor Simmons was very much involved in this discussion, about the whole area of women's suffrage and how Black women had not been included, invited, or enabled, or in many instances allowed to participate. And that prompted a whole larger discussion about the voting rights movement, about voter suppression, about women's suffrage. And it's out of that discussion, out of those discussions grew the desire to invite Dr. Young here to do this play. Had it not been for the COVID virus, we would be seeing this play, interacting with her in real life and with the other panelists in real life in real time. But not to be deterred, Central Square Theater made it happen, and we thank you. And we hope that at some point in the future that we'll be able to bring you to Cambridge, Dr. Young, and meet you personally and work with you personally. But certainly in the absence of that, again, I thank you. So without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Young, Dr. Billie Jean Young, and in turn, we'll have a chance to meet each of the panelists and then have some questions and answers with them. There'll be an opportunity for you, the audience, to ask questions, and not just about the play and not just about our panelists' work in the social justice and racial justice movement, but also if you have questions about voter registration, because that too is a significant piece of this whole Act Up and Vote effort. So again, without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Billie Jean Young, who will tell you a bit about herself, and then we'll move on to the other panelists, and then on to questions. Dr. Young.
Thank you, Eva. First, I'd just like to thank Central Theater for doing this. Of course, I sit there and cringe because I've been doing this show now for over 37 years. And so I've kind of grown with it. And so, of course, the glitches hurt me.
The selection has never been clear, and the stakes have never been higher.
America is flying.
Oh, I'm hearing something else. Do you hear that?
Yes.
I'm hearing the debate. That's what you hear? Oh, okay. All right. So, anyway, I first met Ms. Hamer, I believe it was 1969, over in Tuskegee, Alabama, and she just kind of blew us away. We were young secretaries, and we'd gone to a farmers meeting for the co-op, and we got a chance to meet her. She I asked her why was she doing this kind of work, and she said, why did she choose to do this kind of work? And she said, baby, I didn't choose, I was chosen. And that was stayed with me for years. So once I went to law school, and she died, and I wasn't able to go to her funeral. As luck would have it, I moved to Mississippi, and I was organizing rural women. And they would invoke her name. She had only been dead a few years. But the regular people, there were many regular people who didn't know about Miss Hamer. And I'm just being so distracted by this, by the debates.
I'm sorry, I don't know if we can track down what the source of that sound is. I can understand the distraction. I'm
Okay,
trying to
so
think who
well, just
else
know
is
that,
sharing
and that's what's going on.
Okay.
You can
all
hear
right.
me though.
Please continue.
Okay, and so I decided, because I've been doing theater, I had been doing theater then with young people for many years. I just thought, you know, this needs to be told. This story needs to be told. And so I went into the Delta, talked to Pap and the girls, and asked for their permission to do this. And they gave me permission. My first show was at Tougaloo with many people who had been with her scant years earlier. And I was quite young then, and so I got a little bit afraid because I realized at that point that I wasn't doing some character that nobody knew, but these were her friends and colleagues. And they not only did they accept it, but they encouraged me. I met Miss Anel Ponda, who was in jail with her that night, and she said to me, please keep on. She said, for a minute, I thought Fannie Lou was still here with us. And so I was encouraged by that. My second show was in Ruleville. I was invited to her home, and her girls gave me her room to change in. And it was like she left it. Her wig stand was still there, pictures of her on the wall. And I became very frightened in there, but I prayed, and I was never frightened again. When I came out of the room, Pap and the girls everybody had left. They had left me in the house by myself, and they had already gone to the where the performance was going to be held. And so that's one of the things that I do before a performance. I've done this as an itinerant a performer, going from place to place, one night at a time, over 800 performances around the world and around the United States. So it's not always the best situation I was in, but one of the things I always do is I pray. I pray that same prayer, and I'm never afraid. I have I performed this show under police guard in Antigua, where the church had brought me there, and the powers that be did not want to hear it, but they brought me there anyway, and I performed under that protection. It's been a journey. I call it trotting with Fannie Lou. And that's what I do. I carry her story. I have to apologize for the tech. I don't know how to do tech, so I have to hire people to do it. And I apologize for the lateness of the hour. I have egg on my face. You don't know what it means to me to see that happen to you. But at some point later, perhaps we will be able to do it in another way. I'm a consummate director of theater with young people. That's what I do every day at the college where I work. And so I love you all. Thank you so much. I've said enough.
Thank you, Dr. Young, and no apology necessary. I say of technology regularly that it's wonderful when it works, and when it doesn't, It just doesn't, and it will make your life miserable. But we're overcomers. Everybody on this panel and everybody in this space is an overcomer, and we understand how to go over, under, around, or whatever the case might be to get where we need to be. And so we thank you and we appreciate you, and we're so glad that you're here with us. Certainly not in the real, but in the remote way. And so let me move on. Dr. Janet Moses is our second panelist, and I'm asking you, Dr. Moses, to introduce yourself, tell us a bit about yourself before we proceed to questions.
Okay, my name is Janet Moses. I'm a resident of Cambridge. However, I'm talking to you from Florida, Hollywood, Florida, where Bob and I have fled the cold, the impending cold in Boston, in the Boston area. I'm a former member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and if I shouldn't, it's not former, because I think all of us that are still, all of us who are in SNCC, who are still standing, view the bonds that were created and the work that was done in a way that will carry us through all of our lives. And so I was in SNCC, but insofar as there are many people in SNCC who are still alive, I still feel that that bond and that circle and the work that SNCC was about. SNCC, I've taught school. I'm a retired pediatrician. I'm a mother of 4 and a grandmother of 7. The youngest one is about 2 months old. And I've been a community activist primarily in Cambridge, looking at the issue of education and particularly math education in Cambridge. So I don't know whether there's anything else that I need to add to that, but I think that that's enough for now.
Well, we'll know you more and better as we go into the question session.
Right.
The last, but certainly not the least panelist that I want to introduce is Councilor Simmons. And I could say lots about her, have tremendous amount of experience working with her on a number of different social and racial justice projects, but her reputation speaks for itself. And I will invite Councilor Simmons to introduce herself.
Thank you, Eva. And let me just first start by saying a huge thank you to Dr. Young. As soon as you started telling the story and you said Tuskegee, my eyes opened and my ears perked up because my mother grew up in Tuskegee. So somehow we are connected in some way. So it's just, first of all, to say a pleasure to have you here with us, even if it's virtually. And to echo what Eva said, when this pandemic leaves us, we look forward to having you in our midst. To the Central Square Theater, who is such an artist station in Central Square that brings us so much joy through the art that they do. And then to Eva and the YWCA, I gotta say this, with the YWCA, Eva and I get into what I call good trouble, trying to speak up and act out around issues of race and class, but most importantly, the empowerment of women. So it's a pleasure to be here. Cambridge is my hometown, lived here all my life. I often say northern born, southern raised, because my mother was from Tuskegee, and I spent so many days in Tuskegee. But here in Cambridge, I find it a wonderful opportunity to be able to live and work in the city that's your home. And so it was always a pleasure for me as an adult to be able to work here and work for the Civic Unity Committee, which was an organization established in the city back in 1945. And its primary purpose was to help African-American soldiers coming back from World War II to be able to reintegrate into the city, because when they got here, they couldn't find jobs, they couldn't go to school, they couldn't get housing because of rampant discrimination. I came to the Civic Unity Committee in 1980 as their executive director, would stay there for a decade before I went on to the school committee, and after the school committee on to the city council, where I've had the pleasure to have been chosen to be the mayor for twice in '08 and then later in 16, 17. So I love the work that I do. There's a lot of it. I often say when it comes to Cambridge, as progressive as we are, we're on the road, but we're not there yet. It's a pleasure to be here and talk. And I have to shout out to Dr. Moses, who I don't see nearly enough. So happy to have this opportunity to share this opportunity just to kind of talk about Fannie Lou Hamer, the work that she has done, the path that she has paved, and what we need to do going forward. Thanks so much.
Guess I should unmute, otherwise you'll just see my mouth moving. Now on to questions. Dr. Young, I want to start with you, and you actually answered one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, and that was whether had you had the opportunity to meet and spend time ever with Fannie Lou Hamer, and had she seen your play. But let me back up from that and ask the question, what inspired you? What brought you to the place that you wanted to devote a significant part of your time, your energy, your career to bringing her to life for those of us who didn't have the pleasure of knowing her other than a little snippet that we saw on television?
Sorry, Dr. Young, you will need to unmute. Yes, thank you.
When I moved to Mississippi, and listened to activist women speak about her, I happened to go to Washington one weekend in December of 81, and I picked up a Sojourner magazine, which had done a series of articles on Miss Hamer. And I was reading the magazine. I picked up several copies because it just wasn't a magazine you could get in Jackson, Mississippi. So I picked up several copies to give as gifts, and I got a chance to read it. And I began to read about her, and I realized how little I knew about her. I had thought, you know how we think we know people? And you really don't. You just know what other people think or what the snippet is about them. And so I started to cry because she'd been dead then for 7 years. I think it was about 7 years. And it was from at that point, the light bulb went off and said you could do something. If you don't have to do a play with a lot of people, because I always had trouble getting everybody to come to be in my plays, and it's hard to have a rehearsal with 2 or 3 people for when you got 6 in the play. I said, you can do this yourself, and you don't have to be all slim and trim to do Fannie Lou. So that was December, and in November, we premiered the show.
Wow.
The important thing for me, because Mississippians had told me I probably shouldn't do it. I was from Alabama, when I don't think there's a nickel's worth of difference. But that's why I went to see Pap and the girls. And the girls showed him a picture of me, and he looked at it and he said, "That's show her, ain't it?" And we all kind of froze because he was thinking that the PR picture was Miss Hamer. And I wish she could have seen it. I wish she could know. Somehow I feel like she trots along with me. I have been healed doing this performance. So many things have happened to me as a result of making the decision to carry Miss Hamer's story. She speaks my mother's tongue. The voice I heard as a child growing up. I learned how to speak the King's or Queen's English, but that's the language that I heard growing up. And I wanted to put it in the airways because there's wisdom that comes from people who are not formally educated. And I knew and so it honors my mother and all those Black Belt women and Mississippi Delta women and Deep South women who have put their lives on the line to work for us. Many times unheard of. And I wanted Fannie Lou to be known. The men were getting what they should have, many of them were, as a result of their work in the movement. But you rarely heard any of the women, even in those times, talk about Fannie Lou. And I wanted to change that. And I think we succeeded after over 800 performances throughout the US and on 4 continents. I believe we succeeded in raising the level of awareness about Fannie Lou Hamer and who she was.
Absolutely. You brought her to life for us, and we're eternally grateful.
Dr. Young,
Moses?
so I'm sorry, before you continue, it sounds like the debate might be playing in your space. I don't know if it is, if that's something that we want to hear your words and not necessarily Vice President.
I'm just trying to figure it out.
It's all right. if you can't, we'll just roll on.
It's so close on me.
All right.
I'll try. I'll see what can happen.
Okay.
Thank you. Dr. Moses, you were in SNCC in Mississippi. And at one point, if I understand it, about in the same time frame that Fannie Lou made her initial public statement at the Mississippi, as part of the delegation to the 1964 Democratic Convention. And that was the time of the birth of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Was there a time when your paths overlapped? Was there an influence at all between her work and SNCC? Tell us a little bit about that. Was there something to tell us about that?
Yes, I think so. And I'm going to, Eva, I'm going to reframe the question.
Okay.
Because I think what's very important and what's lost in the history is the role of this insurgent group of young people, along with people who advocated for the right to vote, who basically led an insurgency against the state of Mississippi. And what Mrs. Hamer represents is not only that insurgency, and I'm talking about SNCC, which organized the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party, separate from SNCC, under the guidance of Ella Baker, who gave Bob the list of those people who should be contacted in Mississippi, among whom was Amzie Moore. And Amzie told Bob, my husband, that what we needed in Mississippi was a voter, not just voter registration, but we needed to vote so that we could really have control over our lives, get what he called first-class citizenship, which meant safety from the iteration of the Ku Klux Klan, which was the White Citizens Council, which meant employment, which meant housing, which meant control over our lives, to live as first-class citizens and human beings. So that was the instructions. Those were the instructions that Bob was given. And it's very interesting because when we think of, and I'm saying this because there is a deep history out of which Fannie Lou and all of her brilliance and her bravery evolves. And that goes back even beyond SNCC. But the people who helped organize the voter registration campaign in Sunflower County. I'm thinking of Claudia Liddell, I'm thinking of Uvestra Simpson, I'm thinking of Charlie Cobb, I'm thinking of Dory Ladner. These were young people in their late teens who had been sent into SNCC, sent into the county to live with the people. Mrs. Hamer was sent by SNCC to Septimus Clark in Charleston, in South Carolina. So there's a whole network of movement against the status quo in this country. I was in, I did not go to Washington, D.C., to Atlantic City. I'm sorry, it wasn't Washington, D.C., it was to Atlantic City with the challenge. I stayed in Mississippi. And so what I'm telling you is sort of secondhand about what happened in Atlantic City. But what I understand and what all of the SNCC workers understood was that the claim of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and it's really very important, the party that was going to, that represented the people in Mississippi, not the White Citizens Council, not the main Democratic Party that was being seated at the National Democratic Convention, that was seated, right? That Fannie Lou Hamer was denied. The sharecroppers and day workers of Mississippi who had organized a party, right, to address their interests was denied, not only by the powers that be. And Dr. Jean Young does a beautiful listening to the play when she talks about Humphrey and the soliloquy between Fannie Lou and Humphrey when she challenges him. And she challenges, I think there was some of, I forget now who else she challenged. But all of these people were, including the president, were organized against the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party. And so when Fannie Lou says that I didn't go to Mississippi, I didn't go to Atlantic City for no 2 votes, what she is saying is that the people of Mississippi, the Mississippi Freedom, they will not be window dressing. They have real demands that they want to be met. And they are not, the job of Black people in this country is not to be mules for the Democratic Party or any party, right? And so what she said, and that experience in Atlantic City is one that is sort of given short shrift. It's given short shrift because Fannie Lou could never, as wonderful, as brilliant, as brave, she emerges within a history of struggle, within a history, with an activity of insurgency. And without that, she would have ended up just being, she was the counter. When I say the counter, it's not the counter, but she was the timekeeper on the Barlow plantation, right? So she would have stayed there, right? She went down to Indianola to vote with a group of people who had been organized by SNCC to go down. And it was not just herself, but there were other women who were also part of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. But that history is really instructive for where we are today, because we do not have, when you think about what are the demands that we as a people are making, right, are making to this country right now, those demands have been diluted, right? We are told that we need to go down and register to vote. We are not told why we need to go down and register to vote. What are the issues? Incarceration, employment, the lack of employment, the lack of housing, the lack of education. These are the reasons. So people in Mississippi were organized around the vote so that they could have these things, right? And we in 2020 are still back in 1964 where MFDP left off, right? We do not have a party, a group, I'm looking for the word, of people whose key interest, primary interest, is the well-being and the liberation of Black people in this country. And I think Dr. Young, looking at how Fannie Lou evolves, because she does evolve, right? And she begins to raise these issues at the end of the play. But I think that that's where we have to go. And we have to raise not only Fannie Lou up, but what made a Fannie Lou Hamer possible.
Thank you. The book, Hands on the Freedom Plow, is the story of women who were involved in SNCC at varying levels. And I know that Dr. Moses, you played a role in the evolution of that book. What was, you talk about your experience with Fannie Lou Hamer. In terms of the women involved in SNCC at various levels, is there a memorable experience for women in SNCC that stands out among other or above other memorable experiences?
That's a very hard question. The woman, I'm going to backtrack just a little bit. Hands on the Freedom Plow is a series of essays written primarily by Black women who were in SNCC. There is another book that was written primarily by white women who had been in SNCC. What I can say about the role of women in SNCC is that there wasn't a role for women. We were comrades. Everyone who was a member of SNCC understood that you were risking your life. And you got no kudos for being a woman, and you got no kudos for being a man. What was important is that the work be done. I guess a memorable experience, it's hard to think of one experience. One thing that was very memorable is the fact that and I was blessed to be part of a group of people who were so dedicated, ragtag, but completely focused on the work that had to be done. And the work was thought of as liberating for our people. Saying that, there are a couple of experiences that I had. One was in Fayette, Mississippi. I had been working in Natchez and then had moved to Fayette. And we had the first voter registration day in Fayette. And voter registration is very different. People risk their lives. They risk their lives. And so I'm flitting around encouraging people to come up to the courthouse. These are people that we had visited many times before. And Mr. Brown called me over and he said, and I've written, this is what I've written about in the book. He said, Miss Johnnet, and it was, he said, don't you worry. He said, you just go ahead and do what you're doing. And I was really a little taken aback because he was one of the key local contacts, and he wasn't going up to register. He was sitting on the side by the courthouse with a group of, I don't know, 3 or 4 other African-American men, all of them old. And he said, don't you worry. And he opened up a paper bag and he had me, I looked in the paper bag and there was a big gun. There was a .45. And what he is telling me is that I will put my life on the line to make sure that people can, not people in general, but that people in my community can vote. And so don't you worry, right? I may not go up to that courthouse, and I think eventually he did, but he said, don't worry, right? Now, that struck to what I think about, and I'm tearful because when you think about what does it mean to risk your life for someone else, right? Or to dedicate, how many people would do that, right? But the level of work, the kind of work, the insurgent work, and Mr. Brown had always been there. I didn't inspire him to do that, but his courage, I mean, he had lived in Mississippi all of his life, right? And so here I am, a skinny little girl. I mean, it was the knock on the head that this is more than serious, right? And to be in the presence and to work with people who feel that freedom and liberation is so great that they would sacrifice their lives. If he stood up, he would have been a goner, right? In Mississippi, a Black man with a gun, right, as part of a protest protecting people who are registering other Black people to vote, right? So the depth of the work and what the work actually was, it wasn't just a ballot, but was about really an opportunity, an effort at really liberating themselves from, Mississippi was a slaveocracy. And Mrs. Hamer, Dr. Young, you pointed out so well, Mississippi was America, right? Mississippi was America, right? And so the work in Mississippi was really about undoing 400 years of the slaveocracy in this country. And unfortunately, we have not moved very far from that situation. We have not moved very far. And the prisons in this country are the plantations, right, that existed. I remember going on a plantation, and it was in the Greenwood area. And I think this was the time around the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, because I was working primarily in the Southwest, in Natchez and Fayette. So I'd gone up to Greenwood, people had gone to Atlantic City, and we went out on one plantation to talk to people about voting, right? On this plantation, there's no electricity. There are no bathrooms, right? There was no money. People were exchanging their labor for fatback, for meal, right, from the commissary. So this was 1964, the end of 1964. This was slavery. This was no different, right? Absolutely no different. And so I think that we have to really tell the story of where we are now. And I think that Mrs. Hamer and SNCC, and Dr. Young talks about a Nell Ponder, it wasn't just SNCC, right? But the people who had organized an insurgency to really liberate ourselves, and what some of the obstacles were, right? And you talk about it in the play, it was Humphrey, it was Johnson, but it was all the civil rights, the major civil rights organizations, right, would not support Fannie Lou and the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party. None of the civil rights organizations would, because they had a different idea about what democracy should be and why we should vote, right? And so here we are, right? We vote, but we're not clear about what for, right? And one of our key issues, which is the incarceration of our men, is not on the ballot. It's not on the ballot.
Thank you. I think that it helped us add even more perspective to this discussion. And I was struck by one of the phrases that Dr. Young used that was a Fannie Lou Hamer phrase, and that was American sickness. The American sickness continues. The sickness that you experienced, Dr. Moses, you saw, you worked to combat while you were in Mississippi, Dr. Young, the work that you've done in terms of your taking the Fannie Lou Hamer story to the public brings to light the American sickness. And that brings us to who represents us now, and how are we represented as part of the electoral process. And as flawed as the electoral process is, it's what we've got. You know, I hope that at some point in my lifetime it will be better. I'm trying to explain the Electoral College to a young person not too long ago, and finally I decided I don't want to do this anymore. I feel like I'm telling a lie. But there are elected officials, and Councilor Simmons is one of them, who speak truth to power, who bring to the table the concerns of people in our community, in this community, and that's important. And I think that one of the things that I want to ask you, Councilor Simmons, is you've been, you spent most of your adult life in public service and in public service for the city of Cambridge. Um, city, Cambridge is predominantly a white community. From the statistical perspective, I think it's still about 66% white, and then the balance is made up of Black people and Latinx and other ethnic groups and nationalities. But what does it mean for you to be a public servant, an elected official in a community where the voices of people of color, particularly Black people, aren't necessarily heard as they weren't heard 40, 50 years ago, but it's a significant part of your responsibility to bring that message to the council chambers, to the other members of council, and to try and influence them to our side, if you will?
I'll try to answer that question, but before I do that, something that Dr. Moses said that I thought about. I mentioned earlier that I'm northern raised, meaning I grew up here in Cambridge, but northern born but southern raised. It brought to mind something that you said, Dr. Moses, what you talked about. Black people want to vote because they want to control over their own lives. So let me just start my answer, not directly answering your question, but kind of my own experience about how did I end up in Massachusetts. And I used to always say that to my mother, you could have stopped in Washington. She came out of Tuskegee, and one of the two stories she would always tell was, here I am, here's my mother, went to Tuskegee University, at the time it was Tuskegee Institute, and talked about the richness of that experience and Booker T. Washington and who was there and how it was. But she also told the story about why she couldn't stay. And she said, I couldn't stay because I knew I better not try to go to the polls and vote. She wanted freedom over her life. She wanted control over her own life. And that's what brought her out of Tuskegee. Now, I don't want to paint a picture of a rose garden when she got here to Massachusetts, because the level of discrimination that she experienced here was undaunting. Here she was, a college educated woman, and could do nothing more than be a governess when she got to Massachusetts, particularly when she showed up for jobs and they saw that she was a Black woman. And what she would say that I would scoff at, they would always say, and you speak so well. But that's what got me here to Massachusetts, and probably put my feet on this road toward sort of equal opportunity. The other experience that was also very vivid for me, that put me on this road of public service, was being in the South again and going into we called them filling stations at the time. And when I went there to go to use the facilities, I remember the door being locked. So I go back into the front of the filling station and I say to the gentleman, the restroom, the women's room is locked. And he says to me with a surly Southern drawl, go round back. And when I walked around back, there was the colored bathroom with no door. And I don't think it had been cleaned since the building was built. It was nasty. Going outdoors would have been a better experience. And we just I just passed on it. But I remember before I passed on it, going to my grandmother, rushing by my grandmother, because I want to give this white man in this filling station, a piece of my mind. And my grandmother said to me, you'll get us killed. Those experiences really set me on this path of wanting to make life different, not only for my kids, but in their memory and for them, because they could not do that. Because my grandmother, this, extraordinary woman that ran a farm, had enough fear to know that fighting over to go into the bathroom was not a fight worth dying over. And so that's what sort of got me wanting to do something different. Now, your question, I may have to ask you to re-ask it, was why do this work, or how hard it is doing this work. It goes back to the question of why, if you don't vote, you have no voice. You know, I live in the port, and the port is probably still, in terms of all the wards and precincts or all the neighborhoods, one that is probably more modest in income, but it's the one that gets the least amount of services and has to wait the longest. And still, sometimes I have to go into the neighborhood and remind people, if you don't voice yourselves by using the vote, you will not get the services that you deserve. You will not get the education your children deserve. You won't get the health care that you need. You won't get a affordable supermarket in your neighborhood. Those things that other people, not even that far away, because Cambridge is only 6.2 square miles, and that includes the water. You know, but if you go 4 miles up the road, it's a totally different experience. And so trying to remind my community, the community that I chose to live in, that it was imperative that you go and be heard, and it is easy as your vote. And remembering, and I do this with my kids, trying to teach them this all the time, is it's, even though we have it, we don't have it. There's always these false impediments that are put in our way to keep us from getting to the polls and having our voices heard. So I cannot say enough, we cannot say enough, you know, the work that Fannie Lou Hamer and other women like her that have done has yet to be realized in so many ways. And it is heart-wrenching to know that that is still the case. You know, here in Cambridge in particular, which is an extraordinarily wealthy city, to have this disparity. My wife often says, you know, Cambridge's dirty secret, which is we're not a city of equals, is very, very, very true. You're going to have to re-ask that question, because I know I've gone off the path, but I just felt moved to tell that part of the story.
You haven't gone off the path, you've created a path. You are continuing along the path that we had set for ourselves, particularly as Black women. And I'm sensitive to the time, and I want to shift gears for just a moment, because one of the themes of this evening is the whole idea of, and let me get it right, the Women's Vote Centennial, a historical perspective. And so not only have we looked at the life and the contributions of Fannie Lou Hamer, but, you know, in this 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, it's an irony. It's a misnomer. You know, there are lots of different words that we could use when we think about the fact that, you know, there's all this credence paid to 100 years ago, women were given the right to vote, but those were white women. Mm-hmm. And effectively, as part of that campaign and as part of that work, we were told to go to the back of the bus, figuratively speaking. We were told to go to the back of the parade. We were told that this is not a movement for you. And frankly, as it was framed, it was not a movement for us. Mm. It was a movement around white women's issues and not issues that pertain to Black women and the things that we've talked about this evening, food and welfare and housing and fairness and equity. This was about white women who were, you know, the early feminists, so to speak, who were concerned about the roles of men and women. And as Fannie Lou has taught us in Dr. Young's portrayal, you know, we didn't have those issues. We didn't have those issues between Black men and Black women. We were, as you have described, Dr. Moses, patriots, and have continued to be largely over the years. So let me not go on one of my tangents, which I can do, but I want to just take a couple of minutes to talk about the whole idea of where are we now? What has the right to vote actually brought us, and how is that? What does that enable us to do? You know, Dr. Moses and very sensitive to the issue of the school to prison pipeline. And with some of our work with adolescent girls, we're trying to combat that whole idea that while we try to combat the idea, the reality is that there is a school to prison pipeline. And we've got to be sensitive to that, and we've got to work toward the elimination and the eradication of that pipeline, not just for, it's about Black people, period. Not just males, it's not just girls, it's not just boys, it's a pipeline that is taking us on a road to nowhere. So how do we, and I open this up to the three of you panelists and whoever would like to respond to it, how do we as a community how do we take the message of Fannie Lou Hamer, how do we internalize it, how do we make it our own, how do we organize, if you will, to bring the changes that are necessary, and I keep hoping that they're going to happen in my lifetime, and I'm a little concerned about that because we're still talking the same talk 40, 50, 60 years later. But nevertheless, can we spend a few minutes, either of the three of you who'd like to respond to the question, how has...
Let me just jump in a little bit and say this. When you pose that question, Ever, what do we do? One of the, I think, the most important thing is organize and educate. But let's just talk about educate, which is part of why we do the GOLD program, the Girls Only Leadership Development Program. Most of our young people, our young women in particular, don't know our own history. And that's a fatal flaw, but it's our responsibility. We cannot rely on the powers that be to educate our own children about our own history. They need to know about Fannie Lou Hamer and the work that she has done. I know one of the things that we've done through GOAL, I do in my household, and I'm sure each of you have done in your own way, is I make sure I'm always infusing at the dinner table or wherever we might go. And sometimes we go very purposefully places like the museum in Washington, D.C., is to make sure my young women in my family know the history, the struggle that women have had to go through. I sometimes use my own family as an example, or bringing the story of Fannie Lou Hamer forward. And it's hard with Fannie Lou Hamer because there's not a lot about her, particularly in film. And it's just the way a lot of our young people, if it's not on their phone or on their computer, they barely want to see it. So for me, it's incumbent on us to do two things: tell our own story about our own struggle, about our own path, but also bringing forward to young women in particular, but our community at large, where we have come from, how we have persevered, with a goal toward, now what are you going to do to carry that forward? So that, to me, it's leaving this legacy, of information, historical information, to our community and to our kids. And then last, I'll just say this: women have been voting in Cambridge, the Massachusetts area, since the 1880s. But when I try to research the voting presence of Black women, it is increased. I can only go back to 1920. It's bringing that history forward so that they know how long we've been in the game, if you will, and what we've been able to accomplish in that time. Again, always reminding them that there's so much more to do to make sure we hold the ground that we've made and captured, but also to move forward.
I'm wondering if people have looked at, any of us has looked at Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste. It was recently published. The idea of caste is an old idea. It goes back to the 20th century and beyond. Even the president of Harvard University, in his book, Slums and Suburbs, that he wrote in 1961, he said that America basically has been running a caste system, right? And that you see that most clearly in an education system. And I'm raising that because I think that part of the problem is in naming what we're dealing with. And there are two narratives, maybe more than two, but there are two main narratives I think that have been operating in this country. One is sort of the Horatio algebra. You do these things, you pick yourself up, and you work to be a part of the American woodwork, wherever that is. And we do that as individuals, right? We want, and we do that by some of the very things that Councilwoman Simmons has talked about, educating our own, giving them a history, learning the Black national anthem, all of those things that are very important. But to understand that this country is organized around the maintenance of caste, of a hierarchical system that keeps people of African descent at the bottom. And that's the way it's structured. And so and Fannie Lou, I think, understood that. We don't talk about that enough because in talking about it, it raises a different set of issues. It raises a different way forward. I don't have any, magic bullet in my pocket to say that this is the way forward, but to begin to look at our situation, to understand that it is the result of the structures of this society, right? The Constitution was structured on the agreement that Black people, both North and South, agreed that people of African descent would be slaves. In the North, if you ran away, they were obligated by the Constitution to return that person. This was a primal agreement of the Constitution. So I think that is that we have to rethink. We have to rethink where we have been and where we are going. Bayard Rustin, who was the big organizer, the main organizer for the March on Washington, and was very instrumental in all aspects of the civil rights movement, wrote a very cogent article in Commentary magazine in 1968. He said, from protest to politics. And he did not give MFDP and Mrs. Hamer shrift, but what he did say, he said the civil rights movement of the 1960s was organized basically to provide public accommodations. It was not organized to deal with the structures of this country that were indeed implicated in the oppression of Black people. And I'm paraphrasing it. This is huge. This is huge. So we have blood, sweat, tears, lost lives, right? And we are still spinning our wheels, I think, partly because it's difficult to face the issue of caste. And unless we begin to think about how we are going to undo these structures, right, then the morbidity, the fallout from the system will continue, right, in every aspect, in the prisons, in the schools. In Cambridge, you can't find, Black men don't work in Cambridge. You think about the construction, and I go around and say, on any site in Cambridge and Boston, are there 10 Black men working? No. So this is an issue, and the issue for Black women, for us, and people face this during the suffragette movement, right? What are your interests? What are your primary concerns? 1919, it's the year of the woman, it's the year of the white woman. 1919, you had more race riots in this country. Thousands of Black people were killed. It was Red Summer, 38 race riots where white people went on a rampage killing Black people in 1919. And so we look at this history, the year of the woman, it was also the year of this assault, right? From Connecticut to California, right? Most of it in Georgia, against Black communities. And people don't talk about this, right? Because it creates another narrative about what we're looking at. So I think we have to examine this narrative and understand that we as a group, unless we come up with a plan that involves us as a group, we as individuals will always be exceptions. Obama is an exception, right? In the age when education, housing, health, right? Black women in morbidity is, greater now than in 1850. The discrepancy between white and Black women in childbirth, right? The discrepancy is greater now than it was in 1850, right? When they were African women delivering the babies on the plantation. So that's part of the education, to really take a hard, painful look at what we're looking at. And I think Wilkerson's book does help create another framework for us to see what we're facing. And when we see it, I think that we will have other answers. So I'm sorry to be so winded.
Thank you.
I'll just say briefly, the voter suppression that we're experiencing today, I point out to young people that, that's part of what Fannie Lou was fighting. People like her boss who wanted to stop and not allow Black people to register. And I must say that several of the things that have been mentioned here, some of them were cut out in the glitches in the play as we built up to the story. The story of Snick's work, the story of with her boss man, the complete story. But I try to teach that, and in my work, I'm working this right now on getting out the vote. And I'm finding that our young people just don't know how we have been this way before. I remember that I didn't know until we started to elect a few Black people, and people would say, the first Black since Reconstruction. I didn't know, nobody ever taught me about Reconstruction. And I was out of school, and so I try to make sure that our students understand that history and know that much of what we're experiencing is retaliation for moving out of the place that's been set for us.
Yeah.
It's the place where people, the caste that you're referring to make your own decisions about your own life. And so there's been a reaction to that, which is why the fight must continue. And that's what I needed to say about it.
I would also suggest that we look, and thank you very much for bringing up Reconstruction. We think about civil rights, and we think about civil rights in 1960. But we need to go back to civil rights legislation of 1866. What Black people coming out of slavery demanded. The first public education system in the South was initiated during Reconstruction, Anti-Ku Klux Klan Act, which was overturned after the Detroit riots in 1967 with the doctrine of qualified immunity that this country is still holding on to, right? But in 1866, Africans said that we need to hold the police and officials accountable if they violate the civil rights of anybody, right? So 40 acres and a mule, that was real, right? So I've gotten 3, and I'm losing 2 of the other stipulations. But if we look at that civil rights legislation of 1866, they are asking for everything that we would ask for today. And the only thing that we've gotten out of that is public accommodations. That was the other thing that they demanded. The only thing we've gotten out of that is public accommodations. And by 1883, the Supreme Court had shut down all of that civil rights legislation. And from that time up to now, the Supreme Court has ensured, right, that Black people are not going to have the right to vote. You have the right, but you're not going to exercise it, right? That's the Roberts Court. So there's a history to all of this, and we have to understand that it's not just a history of our exceptionalism, right? But it's a history of this caste structure, and the only people who are going to be at the front end of getting rid of this is us, because we're the ones that's on our shoulders, right? but to understand that this is what we are battling, right? It's structured, it's by design, every aspect of it. But that legislation, and I think we should go back, that should be part of our education, to understand that in 1866, this is what we demanded. And it was overthrown by the Supreme Court, and violence, violence, violence. Right?
I apologize for interrupting. I feel like this conversation could go on for hours, for days. It's just so enlightening, and things that I knew a little bit about, I now know more about. My curiosity, my need to know, my own edification, all those things are now heightened. And I can't say thank you enough to our panelists, Councilor Simmons, Dr. Moses, Dr. Young. You are all phenomenal women. We are so fortunate to have you in our midst. I apologize to our listeners because we were supposed to have an opportunity for questions from audience, but didn't get there. So next time, and hopefully there will be a next time. Support Central Square Theater. They do good work. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Nina, and the rest of your staff. Support the YWCA Cambridge. YWCA is across the country, but we're in Cambridge, so support us. Good work too. It's been a pleasure. It's been a real pleasure to be part of this dialogue this evening and to learn. And there's part of me that wants to be 22 again when I, had my big Angela Davis afro, and I just, my grandmother used to tell me somebody's going to kill you. And fortunately not, but we've got struggles, we've got challenges, and in so many ways they haven't changed. But we've got to shift the paradigm. We've got to come to terms, if you will, with this caste system, and what it means and what it's created for us and how it's framed our lives, and then work to change it. So on that note, Courtney, is there anything you'd like to add before we adjourn for the
Yes,
evening?
I'd like to thank you, Eva. Thank you
My
for
pleasure.
shepherding this conversation and helping to make all this whole evening possible. And I just would like to further encourage everyone here to join us for more events this week. If you want to visit Central Square Theater's website, that we've got performances from our young folks and other performers, other conversations around other rich topics around voting and activism, and we would love to have everyone come and join us. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Have a good night. Thank you everyone for joining us for this little light and our conversation with Eva Martin Blythe, Councilor Simmons, Dr. Moses, and Dr. Young. Please join us for more virtual festival events this week, including community conversations about voter disenfranchisement and the Electoral College, plus performances from the Theater Offensive and our own Youth Underground ambassadors. Full schedule and details are on our website. One last thing. At Central Square Theater, art is our activism, and the Act Up and Vote Festival encapsulates that vision, empowering young people to share their voices, vote their values, and fight for the changes they want to see in the world. A donation tonight helps us to continue to do just that, creating timely, youth-driven theater. Please consider giving at centralsquaretheater.org or use your smartphone to scan the QR code on your screen. Have a good night.